Hello. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm incredibly intimidated, but we'll try and get through it. A little bit about me. My name's Ivana. I work at a company called Customer.io. We're based in Portland, but it's a remote company, so I live and work in Vancouver in Canada. I was born in Bosnia, though, raised in Croatia, lived all over Canada, and then spent several years in Scotland, most recently. I have a degree in psychology and neuroscience, but realized too late that I didn't want to be an academic. And right now, I'm a UX designer, but have worked as an interaction designer, a freelancer, and front-end designer. And I've had the pleasure of CSS being involved in all of those things. So over time and across countries, I've made lots of internet friends and real-life friends. And as a result, I've always been really into how we build our communities on the web, both socially and from a code perspective as well, and how those things interact. So now that you know a little bit about me, I want to ask you guys, what do you do? What do you call yourself? We don't often describe our roles in one word, because we know that there's usually not one succinct title for them. We contextualize those job titles with the technologies and the languages that we work with, but have no real common language for these things. Front-end engineer, for example, might mean something really different to me than it does to you. Someone saying they're a software developer doesn't tell you initially a lot about what they build or what they use to build it. But we simplify, right? We contextualize and categorize because that behavior makes our lives easier. It makes the world easier to compute. But this categorization, can harm our communities too. Because how we categorize is based on what we value. And how we talk about our profession, about CSS, that matters. And that's what I want to talk about. So to do that, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to rewind a little bit. It did start this way, right? Like CSS fit very easily into that kind of design appearance bucket. There was a clear separation between design and development. You had a web designer, and now you kind of have designer and developer, like with visuals being one thing and code another. And you can sort of see these lines building. But the web is growing in so many ways, right? And not a day goes by that we don't see a piece on Medium, and I'm pretty sure I've written a few on how designers and developers can work together best. And the reason we do that is because the lines between them have blurred so much that we don't even know what makes a designer and what makes a developer, because the web isn't just a screen. We don't build a website, we build an application. We build interfaces across devices and contexts, and interactions are more dynamic. These experiences are more immersive. And this needs a much wider variety of skill sets. And this is awesome, right? Because as the industry grows, so do our capabilities. So do our roles and our skills. We can generalize or even specialize. We can focus on CSS as a whole or just on one small aspect of it. And this is really cool. We talk a lot about how we should work together, how we can make development and design work together, where CSS fits into that, and where we fit into that. And yet, we may not say this like outright, of course, or maybe we do. I've heard it. But the implication is always there. It's there when we ask what front end means or doesn't mean. It's there when we ask, which coding language should I learn next? And it's in job postings. It's in salaries. It's in the word development. CSS used to just be design. So what is it now? This is an issue without a resolution, and that lack of resolution has consequences. We have so much fluidity in our roles, And that's OK, but we need to produce software at the end of the day. And the titles that we hold matter because they impact so much. Hiring, team construction, perception, pay, not to mention the actual experience of what it is we're building. And so now it's not so much about developer and designer because we don't build web pages now. The above simply isn't the case anymore. It's not just fonts and colors. And CSS is code, but not development. Why? We say that languages like HTML and CSS are about presentation, whereas programming is meant to describe, and development is meant to describe function. And this was very convenient. But CSS has grown a lot, right? We have preprocessors that require a developer's level of understanding just to implement and use meaningfully. Have you looked at some of the docs for these things? It's like, for a beginner, trying to walk a beginner through some of it, it's like, oh yeah, just fire up a terminal and install this and all of these dependencies. And no, but that's not development, right? But anyway, we have transforms, right? We have complex targeted selectors, like pseudo elements, right? And if you think about that name for a second, it kind of blows my mind a little bit. Like pseudo, like it doesn't actually exist. It's like dynamically populated, and we have methodologies like object-oriented CSS, CSS layout now. And the point of all this is to show that it's not just presentation and function. The code might look really simple, and people might say, oh, it's just CSS. But interaction and presentation affect function, and they enable function. CSS bridges all of that. It touches everything. And expert-level CSS is a key development skill. And these days, like was mentioned in the intro, people are showing off what you can do with CSS. And you can say that this is just design, right? Just aesthetics, but that's missing the point. The implications of being able to do things like this in just CSS was crazy a while ago. Whole games can be built in it. I believe later today we're going to learn how to do that. And this is an example of something that a friend of mine created. Thanks, Q. It's a CSS framework, but it's made up of self-contained modules, and it's developed in a way that draws from JavaScript and from Ruby. Dependencies are managed, imports are specified, and because of its modularity, the CSS can actually be tested. And also, last night at the speaker drink, several sort of folks who work primarily with JavaScript said to me, like, oh, I don't do CSS. CSS is hard. Like, Rachel, one of my fellow speakers, said, like, the most complicated stuff I do with CSS, but that other more quote-unquote developer tasks have more legitimacy attached to them. And even if you do subscribe to the whole, like, CSS is just presentation, fine. As I mentioned, presentation influences the way that people feel about software. It enables successful interaction. If something isn't presented and can't be interacted with in the right way, its function is irrelevant. There need to be people who stand at this, or who code, I suppose, at this intersection of interaction, function, and presentation. And because of how complex the web is, they deserve their place in development. And that brings me to the main point of my talk. We're struggling to sort of delineate design and development in terms of language, to give those things value and find out where we fit while struggling with sort of bias and archetypes. And what happens when these definitions of development and CSS are unclear, unspoken, and like tied up in these complex perceptions of ourselves and our competencies? So hierarchies are about drawing lines. They're about identifying differences and similarities, and then, and this is the important part of hierarchies, assigning them rankings, assigning them relative importance. This lets us categorize and compare things, relatively speaking. Things like languages, the languages we speak are organized in hierarchies, so our colors, evolutionary trees. But the kind of hierarchies that I'm talking about here are value-based, on power and authority in a CSS context. And in general, we draw them because we like to know that we have a place in society within our communities. We like to know where we stand in relation to our others. We're happy when we identify with a group, like a sports team or fans of a CSS framework, for example. And we're also happy when we don't identify with another group. This is social identity theory. We define categories and then we compare. And right here, we're here because we value CSS and identify positively with those who have that skill. This conference wouldn't exist otherwise. And on some level, these things are good. Like I said, they help us process the world faster and understand how to interact socially. They help us be less overwhelmed by the world. They help employers apply people to the right jobs somewhat. And when we're in those jobs, they help us get our work done. And if we need help, it lets us know who to go to. But they can also be bad for the relative importance reasons that I mentioned earlier. And who defines that importance? So let's think about why for a second. Who defines this? Like if I asked you to put some things in the development area and the other things in not development, like where would you put them? And what about the person next to you, or your coworker? I would venture to say that those things wouldn't all be the same. And the fact that they wouldn't be is what I want to address. Because if you're hiring someone, you need to decide how much to pay them. How do you do that? What do you decide first? Like, do you decide the technology stack of the job, maybe the experience? But we don't even know what that means for a given language, especially if it hasn't been around that long. So we're categorizing and determining someone's value before they even exist. And these hierarchies that we have in our minds, the hiring manager, the engineers, this person that we'll be working with, the designers they'll be working with, these all differ in subtle ways, and these ways then compound. And this impacts who you hire. A CSS developer, for example, might be what you need, but if you don't identify that as a valued development thing, you won't hire that person. And this is something that I found interesting. In Stack Overflow's developer survey, they didn't include CSS as a language like anywhere. But at least they're open about it. And I think that the only valuable hierarchies are clear, transparent ones. And it's this lack of transparency that's the problem. We're not drawing these hierarchies between skill levels, like manager and junior. That's its own thing. But across languages, we're building tacit, value-based hierarchies based on languages that are biased by our own investments. Like, of course, I'm going to value CSS higher than Ember or whatever, because I've invested time and money into learning it, and I love it. But I can't assume that the person next to me feels the same, or if even that's what my product needs. So what's the point? Why are we trying so hard to understand what makes a developer anyway? Because we need to, we're compelled to, in order to make our world easier to understand. But also because these hierarchies affect CSS, the language, the community, and the web. Tech is changing so fast that we have no agreed upon standard for what a developer is. There's no degree or certification or whatever, and we pride ourselves on that. Like, anyone can jump in and get their start in it. I learned development on Neopets, for if anyone remembers that. But it's a double-edged sword, because at the same time, we're trying to make sense of how to pay people, how to hire, and how to actually make software. And knowing that we haven't figured that out is fine, but I'd argue that the way we're going about it, this implicit value building, based on outdated assumptions about CSS, that's wrong. Because there's a gravitas to the word developer, like a technical proficiency tied up with credibility that for some reason CSS just doesn't get. And instead of critiquing that association, we're worrying about where to draw these lines. And the problem, again, isn't that these hierarchies necessarily exist, but that they differ subtly based on the company, the person, the job post, and then those reading that information are left trying to infer these categories, these hierarchies. And because we're not clear, we're not clear on the hierarchies, we strip them of their effectiveness. If we don't come to the table with a shared understanding of development and how CSS is a part of it, we can't clearly communicate what we value. And true hierarchies, good hierarchies are clear. They're unambiguous. And if not, we leave the door open for changing interpretations of value, and we leave the door open for bias. And in tech, this automatically skews in favor of a certain archetype. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Like I mentioned, this might be a joke, right? But its repetition is damaging because it becomes implicit. It becomes an assumption that we make going in and don't question anymore. And to be clear, I'm not saying that there isn't a difference between like CSS, HTML, JavaScript, and languages like C. Like, I'm not saying there's not a difference, but what's dangerous is the power dynamics and subtle implications that one is harder and therefore better than the other, and the creation of archetypes around them. This becomes ingrained, right? It leads us to make bad decisions and treat others poorly in some cases, even when we don't mean to. In the same way that categorization makes it easier to place people in roles, it also makes it easier to devalue people. And saying, CSS isn't really development or some variant of that takes away from what I think is a thriving debate around where CSS is going and what it's capable of. And furthermore, we don't talk about it. If I don't know how your hierarchy differs from mine, we'll never come to any sort of consensus. And this is implicit, but the problems manifest explicitly. And the developer archetype, and you know what he looks like generally, is how this implicit, weird, value-based programming language hierarchy intersects with a biased social one. This developer, male usually, sits implicitly at the top of the hierarchy and doesn't write CSS. And to illustrate how this intersection becomes complicated, think about how it might manifest when sort of a white male, quote-unquote, CSS developer and a female, perhaps, quote-unquote, CSS developer of color apply for the same job. What hierarchies are applied to those people? When we don't know, or when we aren't transparent about it, we reach into our subconscious for things we do, quote-unquote, know. And then when that knowledge is already wrong, that of a particular archetype being a developer and good at computer things, we shoot ourselves in the foot. It means that we compromise CSS, the people who use it and develop in it, and we compromise the industry by leaving out people that can actually impact it the most. And furthermore, if we're sitting at that hiring table and we don't hire any CSS developer at all because we don't value CSS as a development skill, it impacts the web even more. So just a couple of examples here. And I think this point, it needs belaboring because it intersects with how CSS perception interacts with the social and prevents people who end up, lower in these hierarchies through no fault of their own from participating in our community and contributing to CSS development. And then CSS development contributing to the web as a whole. And this is complicated. There's so many hierarchies here, and which groups we arbitrarily assign to sort of high and low status, that we've just kind of accepted this, and we've done very little to change it. And beyond that, beyond archetypes and social intersections, whether or not CSS is defined as development has impacts on how people see our skill as technicians and as builders of the web. For example, CSSconf EU has about twice as many attendees as this conference and attracts about 5 times the sponsor support. And of course, a lot goes into that data, but its experience sort of suggests that recruiting and conference budgets related to CSS are much smaller compared to what's spent on JavaScript. So, if you develop CSS but don't know Ember or something equivalent, are you more skilled or valuable or less? Why? And who says? Are you worth more money or more credibility? When we perceive people as more skilled, we give those people power. And these power dynamics are tied up with assumptions of legitimacy. And until now, it's been the assumptions of people in power, people with privilege, that govern these perceptions. Like, we want to say that legitimacy, development legitimacy, is a meritocracy, but it's not, and we know it's not. There are implicit, valid ways to be a developer, and CSS isn't yet seen as one of them, and I believe that it should be. This perception of developer legitimacy is really important for minority groups, for the underrepresented as well. Because these implicit structures, as I mentioned, take power away from those who should have it and prevent them from contributing to development, to the web, to the experiences that we're building on it. And in the office context, perhaps, people are excluded from meetings or code reviews based on perceived language value and expertise, and their input's lost, if they were even invited to begin with. One path into development isn't better or more deserving than another. And this then leads to arbitrary pay scales. If I think development is worth a lot of money, but CSS isn't real development, then it stands to reason that CSS isn't worth as much money. And then if the person doing that CSS development is a member of a minority group, we'll pay them even less. This is a problem, again. And if our attitudes and language-based hierarchies become value-based and vary from person to person, this negatively impacts individuals, communities, and the forward momentum of languages, and CSS especially. And this has consequences on our mental health because, when you see someone as less valuable, even in something as simple as which language they choose to code in, you will behave differently towards them. And just because you see it as a joke doesn't mean that someone else does. For example, a front-end designer who works with CSS every day might be, as I mentioned, excluded from a meeting on a piece of critical functionality because they're not a developer. And this has consequences for them, personally, professionally, and not to mention for the product they're building or the site that they're building. So, and that brings me to, when these applications are built, a devaluing of CSS impacts them too. When we give this value across languages, we don't bring on the developers that we need. This is also from the Stack Overflow survey. You can just see these fluctuations in popularity. And popularity means most commonly used. And there's also, there's wanted as well. So, I'm not taking issue with any of this, and I'm really happy that Stack Overflow do stuff like this. But should the standing of a particular language here influence how people see our competency? Probably not, but for CSS, it does. And I saw this yesterday on my way here, actually. When we as a community devalue CSS as a dev skill, UX and performance suffer, and this is true. When we devalue CSS as a dev skill, when we don't challenge these hierarchies, the web suffers, as do its users. And as CSS splinters into its own subdisciplines and specialties, we have to be aware of our own hierarchies as well, and how that affects our own community, and how we can best mitigate that. So, what can we do then? I'm not suggesting that we get rid of this, or try to get rid of this fundamental human behavior, because hierarchies are fine. They make us feel safe, but they need to be transparent, enforceable, and concrete, and not based across languages. We should feel comfortable challenging them. There are differences between languages, but we can identify and understand those differences and use them to bridge skill gaps and solve problems. So, if something is implicit, right, we can't fight it. If we don't know we disagree or we're afraid to admit it, we can't make things any better. So, individually, organizationally, we can ask ourselves what our hierarchies are. We can write down or somehow record what we perceived to be a developer. And don't just ask the question, answer it. And answer it openly. If we're scared of people having more information, it's a good sign that we're doing something wrong. We can be hyper-aware of our own biases and hierarchies and be honest with each other. Check assumptions not just at the door, but throughout, and call each other on them. Write them down before we talk. For example, in a hiring meeting, what's important to everybody in the room? We shouldn't assume that we know. And if these hierarchies are so obvious, if CSS isn't really development, then it should be easy to state them. Saying them out loud makes them real. It surfaces those assumptions around power and legitimacy, and it takes them away too. It makes us accountable to our definitions. And we can't expect people who are the victims of these hierarchies to drive the change. So those who have hiring power can get across to us the skill that those with hiring power, can get across to people that we value the skill that they bring, not the language that that skill manifests in. If we can shout about CSS as development, we can and we should focus on the skill sets that people are bringing to us and start, getting a handle on those complex intersections that I mentioned. And challenging hierarchies in a broad context means putting minority groups in decision-making roles and challenging hierarchies by deviating from them. In a CSS context, understanding that CSS is technical, is development, governs function, and not just presentation, and it should be valued like the complex skill set that it is. And even if it wasn't real development before, it is now. So let's talk about that. Let's change our definitions. And no, this isn't easy. This is quite. I know they said that I would tell you what CSS development and how to fix this, but I know that we need to categorize. We all know this, and I'm not asking you not to. What I am proposing here is this conversation that those of us who think these hierarchies are so obvious actually take a good look at them, document them, and make them open. No shouting about right or wrong or anything, like just openness. And only then, once we have that transparency around whether and who believes CSS is development, can we drive meaningful change in one direction or another. Yeah, so it's not easy, but so what, right? It's fine to be uncomfortable with disagreement. What's not fine is allowing these myths to fester because we're avoiding having our opinions challenged. We don't have to agree, but we have to come to some sort of shared understanding. Like, why is it okay to use disagreement, for example, in the startup world, in the tech world, to improve CSS, or any other language for that matter, as code, but not to improve the environments of the people who write it in that language? In these interpersonal situations, it's hard to admit, perhaps, that we've hurt someone else or hurt an application or the thing that we were building in some way, especially if we're acting with good intentions, but it's okay to make a mistake, right? And I don't think this is optional. We pride ourselves on solving hard problems, and we can solve this. We can drive CSS forward as development and make what we're building better and make our community better. We can put our money where our mouths are and learn from failure like we say we do all the time. And if we've said CSS isn't real development in the past, it's fine. We can always change the hierarchies and better understand the relationship of CSS to the rest of the web. And for us, like, CSS is just a start. It is development, and let's make that a given. If we do that, or if we sort of set on the path to doing that, we could better understand our roles. We can actually leverage hierarchies the way we're supposed to, right? Better understand our roles as CSS engineers, developers, designers, whatever. When we better know what we value and how, we can know where to spend all of our energies and how to put together better teams, how to make better products and better web experiences. And most importantly, we can make sure that our community is as brilliant as we know it can be, both technically and otherwise. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Wow, that was fantastic.